it's been a fun kind of circle back. I'm from southern Wisconsin. I grew up in Elkhorn, Wisconsin. And then I did my undergrad at Lawrence University. I went away for graduate school in various locations and worked kind of at the interface of freshwater and marine science. For much of my career, I study invertebrates, so all the things that don't have backbones, the invisible plankton of our lakes. But I also lead projects on kind of whole ecosystem things. I work with Susan Knight, who's here tonight, also on a wild rice project, and also at some kind of ice dynamic studies that I'll talk about a little bit in the talk today. But my main goal is to give you a broad overview of Trout Lake Station. So how many of you are familiar with Trout Lake Station? Anyone been to the open house? Oh, I see a hand in the back. Each year we put on an open house where we have about 300 to 400 people that come to Station, and they interact with all the students that are there each year to learn more about it. So I'll give you an overview, but I also try to leave lots of time for questions. So I think of Trout Lake Station as really encompassing what UW-Madison calls the Wisconsin idea, which is pushing out education, training, and science, and all the work that we do at the kind of main campus into more of our communities throughout the state. And so it's pretty easy up here to get folks excited to talk about water, considering how much water there is in the area. And so these first few slides, from a scientist, Bob Sterner, who's over at University of Minnesota for a lot of his career. And I think it's interesting to think about the blue planet and 71% of the Earth covered by water. But if you break that down into fresh water, this big marble here represents all of the water on the Earth, right? That's all the rock underneath. This second little marble, I don't know if you can see that tiny little marble there, represents the fresh water that's both in groundwater and at surface. And then that last tiny, tiny little speck that's just north of Florida there is all of our surface fresh water on the surface of the Earth. It's not actually that much, yet all of our life depends on that, right? And so all of our terrestrial, all of our being, we depend on that water for survival. And so 21% of the Earth's fresh waters are here in the Great Lakes region. A lot of it's in these big few, right? That's a huge volume of the water. But when you look at our area and just north of here, there is a lot of water, and 21% of that teeny tiny marble in our region is a huge responsibility. And so it makes a lot of sense to have water research located here in Wisconsin. We've got 32,000 miles of river and 5.3 million acres of wetlands and 15,000 lakes. And often at this point, it's like we talk about Minnesota versus Wisconsin. They claim, right, their license plate claims, and you can go back and forth, and it kind of comes down to how do you define a lake. What's the size and acreage and depth requirements, but there are strong cases that Wisconsin has the most lakes of any state in the nation. And here in Vilas County, a lot of those are here in Vilas and Oneida County. So we have tons of lakes, and these lakes are called kettle lakes. So the majority of these lakes formed about 12,000 years ago, 12 to 10,000 years ago, as the Laurentide ice sheet began to move north from this area. So as that glacier retreated and kind of scraped the Earth as it retreated northward, it would leave these pockets of ice in the landscape and carve out these scours and create these large kettle lakes. And so a lot of the lakes that we see in this area were formed during this glacial retreat. And they share some similarities in that they kind of have this, deep hole in the center. Some of them are very spherical, and you can kind of see that scouring process. But because our underlying bedrock varies so much around here, we can also get lakes like Crystal Lake and Big Musky Lake. I don't know if you know those two. Crystal Lake is sandy, clear water, low productivity. All the water comes in through seepage pretty much. And it is literally a stone's throw from Big Musky Lake, which is where you want to go bass fishing, right? It's got the plants, it's green, it's high productivity. These two lakes are even connected at times, but they're so different in their chemistry, water clarity, and the amount of nutrients that are in them. And so these underlying kind of what's draining into what, where things are in the landscape, give us a rich number of lakes, but also a big diversity and variability in what those lakes look like. And feel free, if you have questions as we're going, we'll have plenty of time for questions, so feel free to jump in with those. And I think it's always important to also recognize that there have been people caring for these lakes and interacting with these lakes for a very long time. And so here in this area, we are also part of the ceded territories. And so when we think about the interactions for these lakes and the stewards for these lakes, it's been going on really probably even as those glaciers pulled back and people were following the boundaries. Our current management strategy for waters in this area is a co-management plan between the state of Wisconsin and the GLIFWIC, which is a representative group that represents the tribes that were part of the ceded territory and the treaties in the 1800s. So digging in a little bit on the history, the other thing I often think about, now I came here, part of my journey, it was in the 1990s. As an undergraduate at Lawrence University, I had the opportunity to come up and work at Trout Lake Station. Just for my little bit. But during that time, I remember coming up to the North Woods and thinking, wow, these lakes are so pristine. They're so different than the ones down by Elkhorn, Wisconsin, with thousands of homes and lots of invasives already and lots of pressures on them. I came up and looked at these waters and thought, wow. And I still feel that way somewhat, but I also have learned a lot about the landscape and the idea that this is actually, so the center picture there is actually the shore of Trout Lake. And so in the late 1800s and 1900s, the waters in this area looked quite different. And logging during that era depended on waterways to transport those logs either down through the Wisconsin River system or over through the Chippewa system. And the way that that was done is so this is a picture of Rest Lake Dam. The Manitowish Historical Society has an incredible bank of images. Jim Fokker, and if you've ever heard him speak, he often will speak to some of these historical landscape changes and also provided some of our pictures here. But this is Rest Lake Dam, which is up on the Manitowish chain. And they would raise the body water 16 feet. And then they would open it up and ship all of those logs down the waterways. And if you think of a 16-foot flood rushing through with logs and scouring waters, this was happening all up and down the waterways, in addition to kind of clear cutting along the shoreline, because the process would you would cut the pines back on the shorelines, then you'd get into the hardwoods, and you'd push back from the waterways because that was the easiest way to transport wood. And so then when the railways came in, they dug a little further into the hardwoods. But I will say that the remnants of these disturbances to water were present very heavily, about 100 years ago, 150 years ago when they were going on. And so when we look at waters and restoring waters, and we think about that, it does kind of shift that perspective, right? But the other thing to know is that this is when Trout Lake started. The landscape definitely had a lot. That picture that I showed you of the shore of Trout Lake is also the picture that the earliest researchers that came to the area from Madison would have seen. And so up in the right-hand corner is Edward Burge and Chauncey Judet. Globally, they're considered fathers of the science of limnology. So they were some of the first folks to kind of formalize this process of data collection. And they came up to Trout Lake Station, which at that time was a train station just outside Boulder Junction. It was located on the north side of the south basin of Trout Lake. And so that train station served as kind of the easier place to get equipment and to transport, and they built their original cabins at this site. So you can see just a hint of them in that picture. I bet it was in the next slide. But they built the cabins there on a property that's now owned by the Wisconsin DNR. It's the forestry headquarters for, it's also called Trout Lake Station, but it's like the forest. Yeah, we get their mail sometimes. We'll have someone show up like, we're gonna shift your power today. Maybe we wait on that. But I think it's interesting to think about what these folks encountered when they came up. And also, there's a quote that talks about during this 1920s era when they were beginning their work, there were 30 miles of paved road between Madison and Hebron. you go back and relive from that time, cars broke down all the time, there's all these things. And they're lugging around, these big canoes and gear that they had just built, to do the science, to reach the lakes. And Gerrish and Jude and their team of students reached over 500 lakes throughout this region. And they went out and they sampled things like water clarity, zooplankton, temperature, some of these chemistry and alkalinity, some of these things that folks were beginning to realize were important for kind of defining our understanding of lakes. And during that time, new instrumentation was kind of a key player, and they were building it as they go, right? These sampling devices, and a lot of them really mirror what we still use today. But Gerrish and Jude had a philosophy that if enough data were gathered, the data would speak for themselves. So that was their goal in reaching all of these different lakes. So the station, kind of same pictures, but we were actually established in 1925, so we just celebrated our big centennial last year during the summer, and had a great celebration with about 150 alumni that came back and hung out with us in full recovery. So Chauncey, Jude, and Edward Burge, again, were kind of these beginning folks. Burge was Jude's mentor, and they went and sampled everywhere they could, kind of had this sampling philosophy of science. But then Art Hassler came along, so he's in my glasses there, and he worked as a graduate student with Jude. And in his career, he actually took a slightly different approach. He came in during a time when experimentation and this idea that you kind of test a hypothesis and get a p-value of 0.05 in order to make science count. This idea of really experimentation was really coming into play as Hassler was in his career. And the other thing that was happening is Aldo Leopold was traveling throughout Wisconsin and other Great Lakes states and talking about conservation ethics and how we needed to apply the science that we were doing to answer questions of relevance to people. And so these things together really worked to inform Hassler's approach, which at times kind of conflicted with Burge and Jude. He said, just collect the data. And Hassler said, we got to test it. It's got to be relevant.
Yeah, that's kind of my question. So like the original generation, was their goal just kind of like, let's just go and like find information? Like it was just to gather information, not necessarily to like with a hypothesis, like what is happening to the lakes? It was just like, let's almost like find a baseline. Is that kind of?
Yeah, and keep in mind that measuring temperature at 30 feet down in the water
is probably pretty challenging.
How do you do it, right? Like, how do you get that cup to close down there, right? Like, how do I measure water clarity?
Right. Just the whole process of how to do it. Right.
All of those things were new, and then also there wasn't any, shared knowledge with them. There probably was lots of knowledge of lakes in the area, but in terms of them empirically kind of surveying these lakes, there wasn't much there for them to form a hypothesis.
Right.
And I think that's true of a lot of science, right? That observation phase that we think of for science, I would attribute that to their era. But there was also a big philosophical shift, I think, in the, late 50s, but then into the 60s and 70s, this experimented, rigor of testing hypotheses, and that part really, I think, got really reinforced and pushed during that time.
Okay.
So it was different.
Yeah.
And there was critique, and it's fun being in the CFL because we go back and forth on this. We still respect experiments, but there's still this long data collection philosophy that we still think it still holds a very strong value because you can't build experiments or hypotheses without having some of the observations. So we have a fun time internally among us to kind of think about what type of science is happening and what we're building.
Yeah, it's almost like philosophical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still have the baseline data. Yeah, we do, and we're trying to keep it going.
Well, I'm just curious how much it's changed, especially temperature.
Yeah, I'll show you that graph in 4 slides. I got a great temperature one, and then we can also talk about some of the other chemicals and stuff, but I didn't put them in here. But we do have the original Gerrish and Jude data, and then we also have 40, I think we're on 81, so 44 years of continuous data. So Hassler came in and initiated some whole lake experiments. That's him putting was done up at the Under property. The University of Notre Dame Environmental Research Center has a property up in Land O'Lakes. It was on Peter and Paul Lake, and they divided these two lakes with a cute little road that runs through, and they added nutrients, and they asked, how does that change the food web all the way through? And then they went in and they took out the big fish, and they said, how does that change the food web all the way through? And what they found is if you take out the big fish, all your little fish grow, and that leads to a decline in your plankton, which is where I work, and then your algae booms. And so all of a sudden you've got big green algae blooms when you take away all the big fish. Versus if you put the nutrients in, you get an algal bloom, kind of everything goes up. But the big fish don't actually get bigger, they just kind of multiply and kind of overpopulate. It's kind of part of that story. So thinking about nitrogen, phosphorus, all of these different layers, and the fact that there's top-down, like big predators that can drive things, but also your nutrient environments is a big kind of ecological principle that came out of those experiments. And then the other one was the one that I came in the 90s to hit the very tail end of, and it was a large acid rain project on Little Rock Lake, which is just off Highway 51 south of Sparkman Lake, so about 10 miles from here. And this lake was divided with a curtain kind of in the middle of that L shape there. And in the 1970s and 80s, there was a lot of discussion about acid rain. In fact, the rain in this region had reached a pH of 4.7 at times, and we were seeing the implications of acid rain in our waters, both here in this region and in the Adirondack region of New York. And the cause of that acid rain was sulfur dioxide, basically going up into the atmosphere and then forming sulfuric acid that would then fall with the rain onto the landscape. Well, lakes in this area, the pH of those lakes is much closer to, here you can see the pH of Little Rock normally would be around 6. And if you know anything about pH scales, they're a log scale. And so what that means is if you're looking at 4.7 versus 5.7, 5.7 lake is 10 times more, less acidic. So 4.7 would be 10 times more acidic than a 5.7 lake. So for every unit, it's 10 times more. So in this case, we're looking at one that would be 100 times, the rain was 100 times more acidic than many of the lakes around here. That makes sense? Log scales, that's my best description. So when you think of this, so what they did is they went in and they chose a treatment basin and they added sulfuric acid to that treatment basin to take it down to around 4.7, which is what the rain was falling at, to look at what would happen if this acid rain continues and shifts our system. And they did it over a series of, I think, 6 years, trying to make it gradual for the system. And guess what happened? Things died, right? The zooplankton responded first, the algae and the zooplankton responded first, and the fish began to respond once it got so low. The water was clearer, but there were some unexpected responses too. Mercury is stored in the sediments of the lake, and when pH goes down, it actually does a process called methylation of the mercury. So all of a sudden, the sediments began releasing mercury that could then go into the food web. And that's concerning. So that, we have natural mercury in our sediments and rocks around here. And so they saw that the methylation of mercury increased, which made that more available to the food web. In general, it's a bad situation. Well, again, not if you weren't clear water and sandy soils and nothing alive in there, right? But it didn't get to that extreme. But then they also tracked the recovery. So if we do have acid rain damage, how quickly will it recover? And what they saw is that the chemistry of the lake, the pH, returned in about a 6-7 year period. And I came in 97, and a very small part, but the trick was that the chemistry recovered. A lot of things started coming back. Obviously, the fish would take some time to come back, but the dominant zooplankton species hadn't returned, and they have these long-lived dormant eggs. This little tiny zooplankton that lives 3 weeks, 4 weeks in the water column can actually live for 100 years in the sediments. And so they should have this repository to be able to pop back in there. What they actually found is probably that those eggs were hatching, but there was a predatory zooplankton that had survived the the acidification and done okay, that was eating them raw as soon as they came in. So even though the lake had revived, like in algae and chemistry, the community couldn't come back because the dynamics had really shifted. And so, yeah, this experiment got a lot of attention, hundreds of articles in science journals, but also newspapers, and it also got on the floor of Congress and is part of the Clean Water and Clean Air Act. And so, when was the last time you heard about acid rain?
Seventh grade. I remember my teacher talking
How long
about
ago
it.
was seventh grade for you?
We don't often talk about things that we solved, right? We talk about the problems that we have, but with higher sulfur stacks and reduction of emissions, I'm not saying the problem's gone, but it did, and this is just one small part of that, but it was very important research that did get to be part of that story.
What was the treatment that changed the pH?
Sulfuric acid. Yeah.
Another acid.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's what's falling in the atmospheric rain with sulfuric acid. So acid rain is basically.
So that's how you that's how you made it bad. Then how did you get it to de-acidify?
Oh, it did it itself. Yeah.
It did?
Yes. So it naturally, yep. So you didn't have to add a base. So natural rainfall as well as biological processes brought it back.
Really?
Yeah. And so a lot of lakes have what we call water residence times, right? And so in most systems, the water will be there. So if it's groundwater coming in, those are usually a little longer residence times. The water will sit there for maybe 6 or 7 years. I don't even know the residence. If you have a lake where you have an inlet and an outlet, sometimes it can be as short as 7 days or 7 months.
Okay.
So water residence time. So a 7-year recovery, the water could have all just changed out, but also biological processes like things growing and dying, and they change the chemistry of the water. Photosynthesis changes the chemistry of the water.
It's interesting to me that it gets more base naturally, but what stops that from, why does it ever go back to like homeostasis? Why doesn't that continue to get more basic?
Probably because the water that was coming in was filtering through those sediments and renewing like all of it. Yeah, basically changed out most of the water problem in the system. Which would be my guess. Susan was part of this work, so I'm gonna. Any other thoughts on that, Susan?
No, and there are minerals in the soil where the groundwater's coming in, and so
Okay.
that neutralizes
Okay.
a lot of the water.
Did you have to repopulate the zooplankton or anything, or did you just leave it the way it is?
The goal was to let it go, and I think by like '05, these guys had come back, but you could still see some of the biological implications of the experiment, I think, into the 2000s. So yeah, it took a while. All right, so someone asked about long-term data, and this is the curious studio. So I kind of went through generations. We have the Birch and Judea era, the Hassler era, and then when I think of the next generation of folks that were working on these long-term data, John Magnuson, Steve Carpenter, and Emily Stanley have been the leaders of the North Temperate Lakes Long-Term Ecological Research Program. And so this was really a project that started in around the 1980s in discussions that formalized in 81 and 82. John Magnuson was part of that original crew at the National Science Foundation. He was a professor here at UW-Madison. And he and others saw that a 3-year grant cycle for data collection wasn't enough to understand what was happening in systems, right? We needed long-term. We needed to understand climate was already a major concern in the 70s and 80s, thinking about these longer patterns of change. And so in that, they created the Long-Term Ecological Research Program, and we are, over time, we've been one of 28 sites throughout the nation that has collected the same type of data continuously. So there are 7 lakes up north here. So Trout Lake, Alapash, Big Muskie, Crystal, and Sparkling Lake. All 5 of, and then 2 little bogs, Trout Bog and Crystal Bog. So we have been collecting data on these lakes for 40, I think my slide I need to update, 44 years, pretty continuously, which means that the crew goes out every 2 weeks and they do all the water quality monitoring, all the sampling for the bugs, all those things. Sample fish annually, posted for anyone to access. So all of you have access to the LTR data. Since it's federally funded, those data are considered public. And we try to make all of our data public. In the 1990s, they added 4 lakes down in Madison, so Lake Mendota, Lake Wingra, Lake Monona, and Fish Lake. And so this data set is one of the largest and longest running in the world. So it's put into probably hundreds, well, at least hundreds, sometimes thousands of 1,000 publications annually about kind of water quality and these big long-term changes that we're seeing. And it is pretty cool, but also a lot to carry to keep that running. So, like I said, it's collected year-round. Here's our crew collecting data in the winter. These are ice-off date. And so ice duration and ice-off, in addition to being one of the largest data sets, it's by far the most comprehensive winter data set. For a long time, people thought lakes rest in the winter. But any ice angler can tell you that's not the case, right? And so we've been collecting good winter data and ice data for a long time. And so sparkling lakes here, but we also have Lake Mendota, which is over a 100-year data set. And then Mille Lacs and Minnetonka are also on here. What I want to point out is that all of these are sloping downward. So ice-off date, what this means is that the ice-off dates are getting earlier each year, which if you're up in this area during that time, it's probably not too much news for you. And I think one of our current research projects that I'm collaborating with Noah Loddig and Hillary Dugan and others on is looking at that ice dynamic. Not only do we see that ice-off is earlier on the average, one of the biggest things is that we're seeing the variability from one year to the next has increased. And so this is variance of ice-off date. And all that means is like how different was it last year from this year. And what you can see is since 2010, that big peak, it's 5 times higher than it has been for the last 100 years, right? The variability in ice-off. And I think the biggest one of those was in 2012 and 2013. In 2012, we had a truck go through the ice because it was March and no one thought that it would even be a thought. Not all the way, just back. Sorry. Everybody's safe, it was all good, but you pull out of the lake on March 12th and you think you're safe and that would be a normal time. And then this picture was taken in 2013 and it's May 10th. The students are getting out of classes and going to show up on station to do limnology. You got to get your ice augers going. Yeah.
Is there any relation between those ice-off dates and La Nina or El Nino effects?
There can be for sure. Definitely the variability that's being seen scales very closely with some of the La Nina, El Nino scales.
Mm-hmm.
So those events seem to be also having more variability. And so that's kind of the new climate discussion is, are we just expecting higher variability in hurricane, El Nino, La Nina, like overall weather patterns? And so yes, they do correspond, but interestingly, our dates for the ice aren't directly correlated. It almost seems like there's some lag. So they seem to line up, but not overlap. It's like a lagging type thing. Yeah.
Do you use snowfall in there too? Because I would think snowfall would have a lot to do with how much ice we get. I know it does.
It does. Yeah, for sure it does, and we have those records. I haven't studied those as much, but Hillary Dugan down in Madison works a lot on the actual ice formation. So the trick is, if you have a lot of snow, you actually don't get that much blue ice, which is the solid ice. Instead, you get a bunch of snow, it insulates, so your ice doesn't grow. And I will be honest, like, when I first started working, ice is an interesting thing. Ice forms that nice sheer layer that people jump on and ski, but ice actually forms downward into the water. So lakes that blue, that really thick ice actually grows down into the water, which makes sense, right? If you have your surface skim, it's not like it's going to grow on top, so it grows downward. If you dump a really good insulator on top of that, it is warmer, and so it doesn't grow as fast. So when you have lots of snow, you have less blue ice. But you can get like compaction of that top ice, especially if you have melts and like refreeze. So we call that white ice. So it's kind of black ice and white ice. white ice isn't as strong, but it can still be a pretty strong ice layer for the lakes. Another good question. Yeah, so snow and ice matter a lot. We're getting, the predictions and a lot of what's being seen is that we are getting significant snowfalls, right, in some years and then very little in others. So we see a lot of that variability in snowfall, or what the DNR also measures as winter severity, which is a combination of cold temps and snowfall. And that variability lines up really closely with this.
As in, like, the more severe, the more ice there is, I'm assuming? Or is it not?
It's not always, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, in the DNR's book, it's snow, because it has to
Okay.
do with like whether deer can survive or not. So it's the depth of snow plus the number of negative degree days.
Okay.
And so it's kind of this combo. And so it doesn't always align with ISOF. But that number, the amount of snow and the negative degree days, is also varying a lot more than the past.
Okay.
And the other thing that we see is that the central south part of the state has much higher variability than we do up here. Even though we're still experiencing high variability,
Yeah.
it does seem like the lake effect from Lake Superior, we're a little bit buffered from some of the real extremes that the rest of the state is feeling. Which I think is,
That sounds, yeah.
but it also means that those models of change can't be the same, right? Like,
Right.
we need to really evaluate like what's going on here and in other parts in different ways, probably. Yeah. So with that ISOF, some of the things that we've been looking at, walleye is a very important fish, both for culture, for harvest, and for recreational fishing. And so there's been a lot of interest in walleye in response to these ISOF dynamics. Walleye spawn almost as soon as the ice goes out in lakes each spring. And so their spawning date, which is here on figure C, is also very highly variable, tracking that ice. And so it looks a lot like the ice dynamic picture, which makes sense because they need both light and temperature to cue their spawning. So when we think about those years of early versus late ice-off, I think I'm going to walk you through this graph because I think it is an interesting one. This is from 2022, but Zach Feiner, the colleague who worked on this, also has been doing this statewide to look at the implications of ice and the patterns building up. So here the red dots represent years where the ice goes out really early. The darker blue dots represent really late ice-off years. And if you can see the most extreme, so the earliest and the latest spawning dates or ice-off dates are over here, and you don't have hardly any age 0 walleye. All of the points that are kind of here where the walleye are succeeding in high abundance are kind of in this middle range, right? They're average ice-off years. So what we see is extreme early and extreme late ice-off are definitely limiting our walleye success in that first year. And the project that we have going on right now is asking why. So we've been sampling Trout Lake and Escanaba Lake at higher frequencies in that early springtime. Jumana's here. She's worked on this project for a couple years with us. One of our recent graduates from UW. But the idea is that if you have average ice-off, you get that algal bloom coming in, and then you get your zooplankton coming in. Your fish have all the food they need when they hatch out and need to start eating. And then your bigger fish have the right size fish. This is how the system worked for the last 100 years. But if you have a really early ice-off year, the idea is that you can get mismatch, where your algal blooms early, your zooplankton like to have a certain sunlight cue and a day length to hatch out. So maybe they'll pop out at a time when the algae's not ready for them, either early or late. And so in the early ice-off or late ice-off year, the idea is that this food web structure and kind of the sequence of the event becomes decoupled and you get what's called mismatch. So we're working on answers by doing heavier sampling and trying to actually look at when these dynamics might decouple. I don't have an answer for you yet. That's what the data gathering then allows you to face those questions and put out some hypotheses. So right now we think there's a mismatch and we're trying to find it. Some other current research, we talked about different types of data that we're collecting long term. As part of the LTER program, Noah Laddig, one of our lead researchers and collaborators, working on advancing high-tech sensors, high-frequency sensors. So the idea is that for any pattern that you want to test, you need to sample at twice that frequency. So let's say we had a question about a daily event, because sunrise and sunset matter for lakes, right? So plankton move around, fish feed, algae photosynthesize, all these things matter on a daily time scale. That means that we need to be sampling twice daily, at a minimum, repeatedly, through all seasons to get that answer. And that's a lot of work. So high-tech, high-frequency sensors is one of the ways we do that. And so we've got about 40 years of research and development. This is a picture of the platform out on Trout Lake. That's catching real-time temperature, light, oxygen. I think we have chlorophyll sometimes, but that sensor goes out sometimes. But it's capturing real high-frequency data, sometimes on the order of 10 seconds, but often it's minutes or every hour. And so these have been out at least since 2010 in some of the lakes. And one of our current programs that's happening is you can get your own high-frequency water quality data. We've been working with lake groups and individuals to implement a program called LakeSense and DocSense. LakeSense is kind of this big platform. DocSense is you could put it on your own dock and it would give you real-time temperature data. And right now we've been working with some lake groups to beta test this technology. The idea is you put it on your dock, you're collecting data, you have a widget on your website for your lake owners group or on your phone. And you know, temperature seems very basic, but anglers love having the lake temperature. I don't know how many times we get people from down south saying, hey, what's the lake temp? I had to put my dock in this weekend, right? It's the first way we interact with the lake when we get to is often we dip our hand or toe in to see if it's warm enough for whatever you might plan. And so we've been trying to reduce the cost of these sensors. That big platform I showed you is quite expensive to both build and maintain. And so these guys have done a ton to bring down the cost of the technology and to start getting it out to where folks can be collecting data. And then folks can choose whether they want that data to go in to contribute to the science that we're doing, give us more spatial information and more information across those 15,000 lakes, or if you just want to for your needs. So.
I'll charge these two
Yeah.
for an individual dog,
Yeah.
because I know my husband will want one.
I will put you, I can have you sign in to talk with Noah too, because I think the idea is we're beta testing now and they'll become available in the spring. The hardware I think is going to end up being around $250, and then there's like an annual $100 service, or that's for an individual, but like $250 for a lake group, and that's like a pro plan to get a widget and access to your long-term data. Kind of thing. We're working on the budget plan still, business model, but the goal is that they'll roll out this spring, and they are starting to advertise and put it out there. So I'm happy to take your name and put you on his list, because mailings will be going out. So yeah,
That is really cool.
isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's great, and I'll show you the video at the end as we're facing some of our budget challenges. This is one way that we're going to work to support our LTR program, is we need to build some other funding revenue streams to make that happen. So
Have you also maybe checked with like the Garmin people, because I know how they're developing contour maps. They're just gathering all that data from people cruising around in their boats, and the temperature is measured too. I wonder if they're gathering that and if they could give it back to you, or
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I don't know what they do with that data.
yeah, I know that's how they do the contour maps, because you can buy the data from them
For temperature or for the map
for the
content.
maps, and I would think they're getting temperature too.
Yeah, I think a lot of those units do temperature off the back.
They all do.
Did I see another hand? Thanks, yeah. We're excited about this. I think it is, right? It's kind of straightforward, but also the idea that folks could contribute to kind of this map of temperature and understanding long term is fun to think of that part of the partnership. So glad to hear there's interest, and keep you informed. Just a few other projects that we've been working on is that we feel really fit within the community up here. So one of our goals is to make sure that our science serves folks, and so Susan and I have been working on a wild rice habitat Cisco is a whitefish type of fish that was resident in this area, can be found in Trout Lake and a number of others. And after removing smelt from Crystal Lake and Sparkling Lake, the idea was to put some Cisco back in there and see if they could start out-competing the smelt or take hold. So that project is still in effect. We have found that the Cisco that were put in have been still present. We saw our first sign that maybe there was some reproduction happening in one of the lakes, but it's still kind of in the data collection phase. We have a new researcher at the station who started this last year, Katie Hine, and she's been leading a bunch of partnered projects with the Wisconsin DNR around aquatic plants, shoreline restoration, and Eurasian water milfoil. And so this is a picture over at Crystal Lake about 15 years ago. They went in and they blocked off a section with fences and let the plants grow back. And the vegetation, that's here on the right. And the understory and the new trees that have come in have kind of restored this shoreline area. And you can see it really clearly on land. And she's coming in to ask, well, what does that do for the lake? And this was the first summer of going in to re-ask that question, and her students found major differences in the insect communities and the plant communities right offshore of the restored and the continued disturbed areas. And the restoration looked much more like the undisturbed habitat. So this restoration really worked, it looks like. So she's continuing with some of that, but also thinking forward about some of the forestry management practices that we have in the area. Yeah.
Are these shorelines on lakes that are also sampled?
This is Crystal Lake, yeah. So this is one of the regularly sampled lakes. And then we also have some social science projects going on. This is my postdoc, Ray Allen, who's been collecting harvested fishes to look at parasites in these different lakes and how the parasite load has changed. There's a lot of concern by some of the anglers and tribal harvesters about growths or some parasite indication, especially in the walleye populations and some muskie that were being collected. So we've got a few years of data on the different types of parasites. The project's called Can I Eat This? And then also doing some interviews with folks who interact with the lakes in the area to better understand their relationships with those lakes. So that one's called the Zaga Iginam, or Kinship Project. And those are a lot of the science things that I was going to share for today, but I also wanted to point out that as a UW campus, our main priority is training folks. And so at Trout Lake Station, there's about 10 of us that work there all year round. We've got 4 ops staff and 6 scientists. But each summer, we have a crew that comes in and joins us. So we usually host between 30 to 40 undergraduates, early career technicians, and graduate students that come in to run these research projects and to collect a lot of data. And in addition to this, in the fall we host classes, different labs and researchers from all over the state, including UW-Madison makes up about 60% of our usership, but the other UW campuses and partners are about the other 40%. So we host the Vilas County Economic Development Commission, the VCL, the Vilas County Lakes and Rivers Association, county meetings, USGS meetings, lots of Wisconsin DNR meetings. And so the station is used by a big range of folks, and we always are welcoming to anyone who's kind of working on environmental projects or want to host meetings in that way. That's what we do. We do focus a lot on training students, so we've been doing a Limno Launch program. You can always think about like the technical sampling and research that we do, but we also generate life skills that are so valuable. People learn to back a trailer, drive a boat, risk assess. We do a whole program on risk assessment each summer, and have been relatively successful in reducing our risk for the last few years. Just how to socially talk about your research and present, and then we have our big outreach event that the students do at the end of the year so that they can communicate their science. And so this is one of our primary functions, right, is to train that next generation of water leaders. And then we do a lot within the communities, and so we've been running a phenology workshops for indigenous peoples in limnology, and just hosted the big wild rice camp. We have a drawing, water, art, and science program that's been running since about 15 years now.
newsletter mailing list, and we don't overload it. We usually send out 2 newsletters a year and our open house announcement, and maybe like 2 others, but it's not a heavily needed one. But we love to keep people informed, and the open house is always in that, and we do mail the open house announcement to that group because there are folks. But yeah, it's great, and you can, we've got folks working on everything from invasive species to water quality, fish and inverts, and so the students
Yeah,
know.
we ran into them, I think it was on Crystal, where they were, instead of actually catching, they put the big nets out to catch the fish, but they were just taking stuff from the bottom and doing DNA or on the what's at the bottom to see what was pooping, basically, right? So
It works.
instead of catching fish, they just, oh, hey, there's this fish that's, pooped in here, so there you go.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. You also, I was staying on Man Lake, and I biked a sample over because it was green, and I wasn't sure if I could swim in it. So I biked it over, and I was like, oh, and they put it under, and I saw, they're like, all these they go, oh, our algae person isn't here, but let's put it under the microscope. And I saw all these moving things. I'm like, they're like, oh, no, that's normal.
Yeah,
oh, no, I don't want to see that.
Those are what are going to get rid of your green stuff.
But, I had no idea. You don't see it. You're like, oh, it's green. And they said, well, yeah, the algae person isn't there. That whole, they said, don't believe you can see your feet. I don't know, did you ever hear this whole lifestyle? If you can see your feet in a foot, you're fine. I'm like, I'm not going to, that's all I need to come out of my vacation with. Some sort of.
We are fortunate up here. There were more algal bloom reports this last year, but I think a lot of the lakes up here, if it is an algal bloom, it's not as yucky. There's a few lakes that have trouble with it. A lot of stuff down south. Yeah.
So you said the long-term trend is lakes are warming?
The long-term trend is that our ice duration is shorter.
Shorter.
So that.
Kind of correlates.
Yeah.
Is that making swimmer's itch increase or decrease in the larger?
I don't know if I've seen any direct correlation. Knowing the life cycle of those, I think it could, just given that life cycles accelerate for lots of inverts when you're warmer. But I don't know for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Swimmer's itch is one of those where I feel like it's more influenced by the hosts and how many birds you have and how many plants you have in an area. And so I think if those numbers are changing, that's going to be a bigger driver than if the water's warmer a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, birds, lots of bird density for sure.
Has there been an increase in invasive water species as well? Do you study that at Trout Lake Station as well?
We do. We study different groups. So Eurasian water milfoil is one that's kind of a statewide conversation. And I think that the hard answer to your question is that we're only going to see increases in these invasives, right? Like they're impossible to get rid of once they're in, pretty much.
Right.
And so the rate of increase for those doesn't seem to be massively rate increased for Eurasian or Spinings, but it's the number of lakes that contain those is going to continue to grow.
Yeah.
Because we don't, invasive species is one of those really interesting, and there's been an interesting shift in, or a new framework, I should say, that's been put out, and it's called the RAD framework for managing lakes or invasive species, and it's R is resist, and so the more we can do to resist invasives or resist that change, that's where you can, help it stop. So that's where clean boats and clean waters, clearing your trailers, all those practices to try to not spread it or not allow it into a water body are really the way. But then once it gets in there, do you accept that it's in there, or do you spend lots of money getting it out or trying to reduce it? Things like milfoil, or I also work on spiny water fleas, little plankton that invades. There's a little bit of well, what's it doing to the lake? How's it impacting our use of the lake or the other creatures, the other residents of that lake, kind of non-humans there. And so there's a lot of discussion about that because we put a lot of money into milfoil management, but it also provides great habitat for fishes, and it's recreation can be a problem, but not on all lakes.
Right.
And it also kind of comes and goes. So, and then spiny water flea up here, they're around, but you can work as hard as you want to kill back milfoil, but you might take out all the good plants and your
Right.
fish too, right? Or like a lot of the management things, like thinking about it as a whole system.
Right.
Thinking about swimmer's itch as bird management or plant management, maybe a way, right? So there's like thinking about the bigger picture and the implications for your lake long term. So it's been I think a good eye-opening experience rather than, I want this fish here at this density.
Yeah.
How do we make that happen?
Right.
It's okay to want the fish, but you don't need everything else to crash around it. Yeah, other questions?
I know like overfishing has been like a topic in coastal cities. Is that an issue here in Wisconsin, like overfishing or exploitation of these things?
Yeah, I think the question was about overfishing, which I think is a challenging one, and there's a lot of models on the fishing dynamics, especially for walleye right now, because walleye has a lot of pressures on it. The climate change, they're a cold water species, so as our water does get warm or the ice is changing, you just saw like some of these dynamics are putting pressure on their spawning. And there's definitely a lot of harvest that goes on for the walleye species, and we do know that their numbers are declining throughout the area. And so that's one where we're watching really closely, whether that's, I think right now what you read is that it's a lot of combinations of these environmental factors as well as us not changing our practices as consumers. And so I think people are talking a lot about that, and what happens when some of those species go is we get warm water species that fill that spot. And this is also what happens in the ocean, right? When you see a species get over-harvested or challenged in the environment, usually another species will come in to fill that could serve our needs or not. So, I don't know. It's definitely part of the conversation, and I think it always will be, and it's very important. All right, you guys want to see the students' video? So we are in a period of challenge in terms of, as you saw, that LTR program that's been running, its funding is in jeopardy as our federal cuts to the National Science Foundation are occurring. And so we are working really hard to get the message out of what Trout Lake Station does and how those federal dollars make it into our communities. And so this was the challenge that the student was given, and I think he did a lovely job of just showing a broad picture of our work, but you can judge for yourself. You hear that a little bit?
Trout Lake Station is a campus of UW-Madison that's located in Boulder Junction, Wisconsin, and the main mission of Trout Lake Station is to conduct research on the waters in the area. One of the things that's unique about Trout Lake
Take me off your Wi-Fi. Try this.
Trout Lake Station is a campus of UW-Madison that's located in Boulder Junction, Wisconsin, and the main mission of Trout Lake Station is to conduct research on the waters in the area. One of the things that's unique about Trout Lake Station is the fact that it has a 100-year history. So it was one of the first research stations to focus on our inland freshwaters. The lakes in this area are a huge part of everyday life. Up here, if you ask somebody where they live, they don't say, oh, just off Highway 51. They say, oh, I'm up on Little Spider Lake, or oh, I'm on the south shore of Trout Lake. You're part of a community when you're part of a lake. The relationships with water in this area are very important. Our research is a big part of how we can maintain
See, you don't have enough money.
We do.
Start training with
Research project. All your physical parameters like temperature, dissolved oxygen, and sedimentation rates, and all the biological stuff. Fish, zooplankton, plants, bugs, it's all there.
The LTR program is 40 plus years old across multiple different administrations who have all seen the value of collecting place-based long-term research and the value that that data provides not only the scientific community, but also research managers, stakeholders, towns, cities, as well as just individuals.
The fishermen are using it for water temperature, when where to fish. A lot of the sailing groups and outdoor groups like hookers really want to know what the wind speed, water temperature. The LTR program is giving the opportunity to so many students over the years to learn about science and learn how to become a scientist and do science.
I don't think I would have the same path in life if I never came to Trout Lake. There's just so many people and everyone's so helpful and wants to make sure that you succeed in what you want to do and figure out what you want to do. Being it from the data collection and analysis side, it's just such a large data set that barely anyone else in the world on any science project has, because we have 40 years of data now, and you can't look at long-term changes without having long-term data. So the LTR data set is really important, and just being like a part of it and a part of the LTR community is so special, and it's really had a big impact on me. Trout Lake is probably my favorite place on earth, to be so honest. It's just, there's no other place like it, and yeah, there's other field stations and things like that, but you don't get the same community, you don't get the same mentors, you don't get to live on a lake and actually enjoy it, and also get to see all the science behind it. We also do a whole lot of things with the public schools as well, including schoolyard, LTER.
Currently, I teach 7th grade at ABW School in Arborvitae. We have close to 100 students every year coming through Trout Lake Station to experience winter limnology and the study of our freshwater lakes in the area and getting to know what Trout Lake Station is all about and what it provides for our community. So for the 23 years I've been a part of this, that's thousands of kids who come through this program and experience it. All of our research, all of the data that we collect, all of these educational events that we put on are essentially free to all the public. So we are funded by National Science Foundation, and that's cents on the dollar, if that, for what you get in return.
National Science Foundation dollars don't stop at our doorway, or the dollars don't stop at the doorway of UW-Madison. That money goes directly into our communities.
So the National Science Foundation is a U.S. federal agency that's charged with funding and supporting fundamental research and activities across all non-medical fields of science and engineering. The National Science Foundation is proposing to basically refocus NSF into 6 different priority areas, which are AI, quantum information science, biotechnology, nuclear energy, and translational science. When we think about doing the type of science that LTR does and the type of science that happens at field stations like Trout Lake Station, when you hear that list of names of AI, quantum mechanics, nuclear energy, you don't hear environmental biology. There's no longer a division of environmental biology where you have a whole 80 or 90% of the research that happens at the Center for Limnology is federally funded. About half of the research budget at the Center for Limnology is part of the North Temporary Long-Term Ecological Research Program. Here at Trout Lake, it represents about half the staff up here are funded by that program. The loss of that funding would be a loss of about 50% of the staff, along with the research that goes along with that. The records that we have as part of this long-term ecological are unique in the world, and that's not something that you come back from.
Our lakes are largely very healthy and in good shape, and they're very usable. They're user-friendly, and it's really easy to take that for granted. If you live in a place where they've always been like that, and if you've always been able to essentially use them in the same way that you have, but you don't have to go far, even just within Wisconsin, to find out that that's not the case if you don't take care of them. The way we take care of them is by knowing what could be a threat to them, and we do that through science.
Sustained place-based ecological observatories like Trout Lake Station are a bedrock of resilient science-informed communities. Investing in long-term monitoring not only advances our fundamental understanding, but also equips managers, educators, and citizens with the data they need to safeguard the lakes for generations.
gonna help